और डॉक्टर अता ने फरवरी के एंड में एक आर्टिकल लिखा था द न्यूज़ में, उसमें आपके ऊपर कुछ एलिगेशंस थे और एचईसी के ऊपर कुछ एलिगेशंस थे। तो उन कुछ स्पेसिफिक एलिगेशंस ऐसे हैं जिसमें मैं जानना चाहता हूँ आपके बारे में। कुछ कुछ एलिगेशंस ऐसे हैं जो कि डिमॉन्स्ट्रेबली रॉन्ग है, इतना आसान है देखना कि वो रॉन्ग है। फॉर एग्जांपल, एक उन्होंने बात ये की कि जब आप एचईसी के चेयरपर्सन बने थे तो आपके सिर्फ 4 पेपर थे। ये बात उन्होंने लिखी हुई है, राइट। इसके अलावा दूसरी बात उन्होंने ये कि आई थिंक उसके बारे में आप जियो वाले इंटरव्यू में कुछ बात कर चुके कि जो यूनिवर्सिटीज हैं वो नई यूनिवर्सिटीज बनाते गए, ठीक है, और एचईसी कुछ भी नहीं करता था। आपने आई थिंक ये बात कही थी कि हम आपको ये बताया गया था कि इट्स अ पॉलिटिकल थिंग, तो इसमें आप इंटरफेयर ना करें। अगर आपने कुछ और ऐड करना हो तो आप कर सकते हैं। तीसरी चीज ये कि मेरा जितना नॉलेज है, मुझे जितना पता है कि देयर इज अ प्रोग्राम नोन एज आईपीएफपी जो कि फ्रेश पीएचडीज की इनटेक करता है। लेकिन उस आर्टिकल में ये भी लिखा हुआ है कि जो फ्रेश पीएचडीज हैं जो फॉरेन से पढ़कर आते हैं, उनकी नॉन एब्जॉर्बेंस जो है ये भी एचईसी का एक क्या कहते हैं बहुत बड़ी प्रॉब्लम है कि वो उनको एब्जॉर्ब नहीं करती है। तो इन तीनों एलिगेशंस के बारे में आप कुछ कहना चाहेंगे? अगर जिनान ने कुछ ऐड करना हो तो वो कर सकती है, नहीं तो फिर आप या ओके यू कैन टॉक अबाउट इट।
देखिए जी, let's take the first one. I have a number of papers. I've published books. I have chapters in books. Even in addition to that, I've published policy papers. When I was at the UN, I was doing a lot of policy work, and every single thing has added to the way in which we understand things. 3 areas in particular: sustainable development more generally, and its relationship in particular to climate change. But also the philosophy of knowledge is an area that I have been particularly active in. And then
the epistemology या कोई और area?
It's epistemology, but it's the philosophy of knowledge, particularly in economics related fields, right? Okay. Social sciences means philosophy of knowledge. For instance, one of my earliest papers was it was called Modernization and Its Discontents, in which I basically analyzed development as a way of thinking, right, and what its implications are for both economic change and for political change, right? So development as a way of thinking को मैंने किया। इसी तरह earlier on my book Economic Liberalization में I focused on trying to look at macroeconomic policy as through the lens of the philosophy of knowledge. Then I had a book called Who Will Save the Forests? And again, the same idea that I approached was, how do people think about forests, and what difference does it make the way they think about the forest, right? So it's a slightly different way of approaching the same problem. So, but to come back to it, sustainable development, philosophy of knowledge, and then social justice. Because for me, both sustainable development and philosophy of knowledge are driven by the same idea of justice. And as I said, I've written books, papers, etc., etc. They have techniques of crediting some works and not crediting others, right? तो उस तरह से वो फिर वो 4 का जो नंबर उन्होंने पता ही निकाला है, मुझे नहीं, मेरे साथ नहीं शेयर किया. But in any case, that's neither here nor there. My concern in all of this is that you have to think that here is a challenge that the world needs to know. And can you expand the sphere of knowledge? And every one of those papers that I've written is something that expands the sphere of knowledge. I mean, so once you read it, you understand how this thing is constructed and how do we go forward beyond it. Particularly governance, which is another framework that I've used. Governance I've done a lot of work in trying to bring governance as a way of understanding the nature of social change. Now, that, of course, in the past was not understood, but I think it's a credit to the research committee that it did pay attention to some of these things. Now, I did not really want to give any more importance to this allegation than it deserves, so I did not really respond to it. Anybody who works in areas of sustainable development, in areas of climate change, knows what I have done, and that's good enough, and they can go up and look at it. So I think what Atta says is just utter nonsense. And beyond that, I would not take further issue with it. Now, the second thing is the new universities. Again, my view about this is very simple, which is that if somebody wants to set up a university, let them set up a university. So if I don't say something to the private sector, I will not say something to the public sector. But what I did say to the public sector, and I said this explicitly to the Prime Minister, was that if you set up any new universities without giving me any funding, I will not give them any funding, because I will not take money out of an old university in order to pay for one of your sort of new projects, pet projects. So that was a kind of a way of protecting the existing universities from this kind of an onslaught that is taking place. Now, again, in case this government goes, I think we'll have a basis for coming up with a more harmonious decision and discussion on the manner in which universities are to be expanded. But it was something which, on a matter of principle, I said, if the Habib family comes in and says we want to set up a university, I will not stop them. Because I'll say, you set up a university, you run it according to this thing. If, let's say, the government of Punjab says we want to set up a university, my response to them is, by all means, do that, as long as you fulfill my standards, which means you cannot start teaching unless you have so many professors and so much infrastructure, etc., and also that I will not commit any recurring grant resources to you, right? So as long as those two things are understood, you go ahead and do this. And I still stick by that. I think if there's a more reasoned discussion, we'll be able to reach an understanding and clarity quite soon. The last point you raised was about IPFP. This was a kind of a stupid program, because it was trying to provide a backdoor for selection. And they had set up a system in which there was a kind of a appointment, let's say, in large numbers without kind of a due process. So, and HEC was basically selecting people and then basically asking the universities to appoint them without kind of the detailed due process, and then say, "Acha, ek saal baad aap dekh." So my view about this is that, number one, this kind of a backdoor is not something that we need to stop. Number two, we need to base it on merit so that it becomes useful for the universities. Number three, we also need to fill any gaps that might exist in our educational program so that people are better equipped in order to deal with this. So the third thing, the last thing is that we don't want this to appear as an alternative to finding a regular academic job, right? So it's basically that, this is, to help you prepare for finding an academic job, right? So, the best way to define it is it's a fellowship, that HEC provides a fellowship, and or a postdoc fellowship. And the purpose of the postdoc fellowship is both to give you experience and to give you some time to prepare yourself for the regular job market, right? That's the idea. We also wanted it to be based on merit. So one of the things we did was to try to assess the quality of different entrants, and we found huge gaps, right? Very fundamental matters that people who have done a PhD should know or should be able to practice were not there, that they had not been exposed to the kind of academic environment that they needed. And that's true, because when you start putting people in places where there's no academic community to speak of, they don't learn all of the skills and competencies that they will need. So the first thing is we assessed their gaps. Second thing is we provided a training program. And the third thing is that we actually placed them as fellows for a limited period so that they could apply for jobs. In the past, the HEC insisted that the university which took them as fellows should hire them. I don't think that is right. The university should always hire the best people. If they do know somebody better, that does give people a slight edge, but it's a slight edge, right? So if they already have an internal candidate, it doesn't mean that an excellent external candidate would have no chance whatsoever. But they know more about the internal candidate, and so they would have an edge. But we don't want this to become a kind of as I said, a backdoor to entry into academia. So that was the second. So we have transformed it. It's actually a much better program. It's actually a meaningful program. But more importantly, it has gotten rid of all of the discretionary and favoritism-based elements that existed in the previous program. So wo sabko humne khatam kar diya. Now, in the future also, I think we are quite insistent on this. And as soon as the current crisis disappears, we will put that back into operation. Right? It's now a very good program. I think it will help people. The one last thing I do want to say is that yes, there has been the cutting of funds to the universities has actually reduced the number of jobs, and by reducing the number of jobs, there has been some unemployment. But I also feel that it's a double-edged sword, that because giving PhDs without the kind of training that PhDs deserve to have, you are forcing them into unemployment, right? I mean, to give an example, if I am chairman of HEC and I advertise a position, let's say as director or director general of some division, and I get candidates, some with PhDs, some with masters, some with basic undergraduate degree, I will pick the best person. I will not pick the person who has a piece of paper which has no, kind of a substantive value. I will pick the best person for that job, and that best person might happen to be somebody with an undergraduate degree, right? Depending on what the position is. For a teaching job, I would prefer somebody with a PhD. But to be honest, if I'm a vice chancellor and I get a PhD, somebody with a PhD who really doesn't know either the subject or teaching or communications or any of the other skills that we need, and I find an undergraduate or somebody with an undergraduate or a master's degree who does know those things, I will choose that end. My advice to vice chancellors and my own philosophy is you always choose the best person. You choose the person who you think is going to succeed in the work that you are going to assign to. And that's a very different approach from just saying, look at the credentials first and then do everything else. That's not the right approach.